Welcome everyone to this intro session on web components. Today I want to take you along in the world of web components. You will find out what web components are, how they are built up, the ups and downs, and of course I also want to present you with some use cases. And after that, to top it all off, I will code a web component to show you how easy it actually is to set up a vanilla web component. But first, let me give a short introduction about myself. So my name, as you already heard from Rishi, is Hordijk. Started at Capgemini as a junior front-end developer on 1.1.1.1.1. So quite a while back already. In multiple different large projects at big financial institutions, I grew towards the managing software engineer that I am today. Currently, I'm building some cool front-end stuff at ING, and of course, I'm using web components over there. Then a little bit about my personal life. I live in Leusden together with my fiance and my 2 cats. And in my free time, I love sports. Both doing sports, as you can see in 3 of the 4 pictures on this slide. But I also like to watch some sports, which is the 4th picture. And I'm going to leave it up to you to spot the picture where I am actually watching sports. Well, now you have a better idea of who you have in front of you. Let's first dive into the history of today's topic. So I made a short timeline, starting with in 1998, Microsoft actually started implementing a way to extend the DOM by adding attributes that could change the behavior of the default HTML tags that already exist. Since it was too complicated to use, and therefore it was abandoned actually by Microsoft itself, and it was not supported anymore from 2011. Separately, Mozilla tried to have a similar approach as Microsoft did with Mozilla XML binding language. This approach was actually closer to the web components that we know today, but the implementation was quite poor. And it was only working in Mozilla products, and therefore Mozilla discontinued this language in 2012. Then starting from the year 2009, large JavaScript frameworks like AngularJS and React actually started popping up. They tried to implement the component idea in a way where it would work in all browsers. Up until today, we all know the big JavaScript frameworks that can be used to create complete applications with a component mindset. And then in 2012, mainly driven by Google, the first version of the web components specification was released. The goal of this specification was to have standards for setting up and using web components in any browser without the need of external libraries. Oh, wrong button. Looking at the web components specification, what is it? It basically is a meta specification which contains 4 different other specifications. The custom elements specification, the shadow DOM specification, the HTML template specification, and the ES module specification. In the next slides, I will go deeper into these 4 different specifications. First one, the custom elements specification. This gives us the possibility to define new custom HTML tags. After defining it, it can be placed anywhere in the DOM, as you would actually also do with the normal HTML elements. The custom element specification is a cross-browser standard that does not need a library or framework to work. And what is also good to mention here is that since it's a standard that all browsers implement in the same way, existing accessibility features, for example, can be leveraged out of the box. The next part of the web component specification is the shadow DOM specification. The global nature of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can cause issues when web apps get bigger. When creating a new class or ID on your HTML tag, there is no way of knowing this class or ID is unique in the entire DOM. Next to that, CSS specificity becomes a big issue, causing style selectors to grow out of control, which in turn can then hamper the performance. The shadow DOM specification was actually created to fix exactly those issues. It introduces the possibility to scope your styling and hide the implementation details of your custom component. This makes it possible to use a web component wherever you want without having to worry about naming collisions or styling issues. Then over to the HTML template specification. The third specification that is part of the web component specification. All the big MVC frameworks, as I just mentioned, like Angular, React, Vue, they implement some form of templating for the rendering of their views. However, they all do it in a slightly different way. Well, since most developers are as lazy as possible, there was a desire for a standard for reusing pieces of HTML. This is where the template element from the HTML template spec comes in. This element makes it possible to declare fragments of markup which are parsed in HTML, but actually stay unused on page load. So at any moment at runtime, the template can be initiated so that the DOM is only filled with HTML that it actually is showing at that moment. And last but not least, we have the fourth specification, which is the ES module specification. In bigger web applications, splitting up the view in components become more and more important. You want to keep your code and your files readable and small. To achieve this, the ES module specification was introduced. In a nutshell, this specification defines the inclusion of JS files in other JS files. At client side, ES module files are actually merged into one big file, so that they only have to load one file. But with build tools like Webpack, for example, you can also do that ahead of time so that the browser doesn't need to do that, merging on runtime, basically. Yeah. All right. So now that we know what web components are and what they consist of, it's about time to look at the pros and the cons. So let's start here with the pros. With web components, both the functionality as the styling of your view are scoped. This means that you can place the components anywhere on a page without affecting the other parts surrounding it. This also causes web components to be very well shareable and reusable within big organizations, because if you have a lot of different applications, then you can use your web components anywhere you want, and it will all behave the same way wherever you place it. For creating and using web components, no third-party libraries are required. The web component specs are implemented in all major browsers, so that you don't need anything to run them in your browser. Maarten will later on explain why, despite of the fact that it's not really needed, it would still be beneficial to use a library for setting up your components though. So keep posted for that. All right, next one. Using web components make the template code really readable. To give an example, if you're looking for, let's say, the footer in your template of your entire big application, normally, you would probably be looking for a series of divs with footer classes on it, for example. But with having a footer component in there, it's actually really easy to spot the location of this footer in your entire template. This also makes the coding with web components feel really natural. And then last but not least, you can deliver functionalities without complex dependencies. So if you, for example, build a component using React, including them in an application would always mean that you have to include the complete React library as well. With web components, this is not the case, since they don't need a third-party library to actually work. Then over to the downsides, which are obviously also there. Since web components make use of the shadow DOM, SEO will actually take a big hit by using web components. It's harder or sometimes even impossible to let your website be crawled by search engines, which can have a big impact on an organization, because if you cannot be found on Google, then let's say you don't exist. Next to that, it's not possible to share styles properly between web components, since the shadow DOM almost does not let any styles bleed through. They cannot be used by other components. This could be solved by having a generic styling package, for example, which is used in all the different components. But since this is introducing an external dependency again on the component, it's not really an ideal situation, I would say. Then another downside is the initialization speed of web components. Well, since web components have to be registered in the browser using JavaScript before it can even start thinking about rendering itself, there is some delay in the first paint. Then the last point I want to mention here is, it's becoming less of an issue lately, since more and more people are actually adopting web components, which is of course really, really cool. However, compared to the, let's say, big frameworks in the front end, the community and support for web components, especially in the edge case scenarios, is really still an issue. This causes organizations to need a certain level of seniority, since some issues have to be sorted out without any help from the internet, because nobody has encountered it before or nobody wrote about it. A good example of this actually was an issue we faced with web components inside a project that I did at one of the biggest banks in the Netherlands. There was not a lot to find about that issue on the internet, so in the end we just had to construct our own solution to make it work, since it seemed that there was not really an out-of-the-box solution for the issue we had. So in that case it can actually take more time to develop a certain scenario, because there are some issues that are not happening for other people yet. All right, since now you're all experts on the topic of web components, let's look at useful and less useful scenarios for web components. So when should you really consider using web components? Well, first of all, if you want to create a library of reusable components, which is less likely to get redundant or unusable, go for web components. Since web components are framework agnostic, they can still be used if your organization, for example, chooses to switch to a different front-end framework for their applications. If they move from React to Vue, for example, then your web components will still work. The second point would be that if your organization is using multiple different large frameworks in their organization, which is most of the times not a good idea anyway, but if they would do that, web components can actually really help you, because they can freely be shared between all the teams, regardless of what framework they are actually using, because they have no impact on the functionality of the web components, so you can use them in all situations there. Then the last point where it would be useful is that if your organization has a desire to not use a framework at all, it is even possible to create your entire front-end application landscape using web components. You are probably going to need some extra investments in time to actually have things like store management up and running. But I would say the sky is the limit. So if you want to invest some time in it, it's very much possible to not use a big framework and just use web components as you like. Then over to the use cases for which web components might not be the best choice, because I don't want to be the biggest supporter of web components here and say everyone should use them, because there definitely are scenarios where you really should not want to use them. For example, if SEO is a really big deal for the application that you're going to build, don't go for web components. They're just not equipped to have SEO optimized to the max. Next to that, if your organization puts a big priority on having the first paint as quickly as possible, web components will not be as quick as using, for example, plain HTML or optimized server-side rendering. Then these would probably be better options to go for. Then the last point would be that if you're building one single application where reuse is not really possible or not really needed, a larger front-end framework or maybe even server-side rendering might be a better choice for you, because it just brings you more out of the box, and it's just easier to build your application completely in that way. All right. Then let's dive into some code. mouse is over there. I see my mouse 2 times. Oh, that's nice. All right, here we are. So what I'm going to show you is actually I'm going to build a counter component for you completely in JavaScript and HTML. So I'm not going to use any library for that. So just a vanilla web component. And when I actually build that component, I'm going to use that component in 2 big frameworks to show you that you don't need to do anything extra to be able to use web components in big frameworks as well. So the first thing I will do is I will just create an index.html. I will increase the font size because otherwise no one can read it. Well, I hope this is better. So we will start with an index file which is completely empty. And then the only thing I will add is our nice web component. So what I added here is just a simple button and my awesome counter component. So as you can see, it doesn't, my editor already doesn't recognize the HTML tag because it obviously isn't an HTML tag. But this is just a web component. Well, if I'm now going to open this, then we can actually see that the button is here. My web component or my something element, which is not something yet element, is actually already visible in the in my developer tools. But yeah, obviously it's not on the screen yet because we don't have anything for it yet. So what we will do then is actually add a script tag where we are going to load the JavaScript of our counter component. And I will add the JavaScript file, which is going to contain my, let's see if I can increase the font of this as well, which is really hard without a mouse and a keyboard, but I think this is already better. So what I will do first is I will just create a clean web component, which is basically this. So we have the template which we are going to create here. So this is from the HTML template specification that I talked about earlier. Actually, now I think of it. So this is basically the ES module specification part. So we can actually include JavaScript files in here. So this is the smallest thing that you can actually add, and that it already is a web component. So what I can now show in the browser is if I actually reload it, nothing changed because I still did not add any HTML to my component. But what you can see here is that it actually has a shadow root now. Well, there comes the shadow DOM specification into play. So this is already quite nice. So it's a really small amount of code, but we already have built our first web component. But it actually doesn't really do something yet. We don't see anything on the page. So let's add an actual template. Well, this is quite big, but at least it's readable. So basically what you do, you create your template element. And what you then say is that the HTML within your template element, just put in, in this case, a style tag with some styling, which is not too important for now, and some HTML. So we have the slot tag here, which I will discuss later. We have a simple button, a span, where you actually start with a number and another button. So if we go back to the browser now, the other way, is, well, we have our beautiful counter component. What is really important to actually notice here is that we have buttons here and we have a button here, but this button is actually styled because we added the styling in our template, but this button just looks the same as it already did before. This is a perfect example of how the shadow DOM works. So if you give styling to a certain element, it only contains in that single component and it will not go outside. So if you use this somewhere else, it will not hamper styling of whatever is surrounding it. To even further show that is I can actually add some style to the button we have surrounding. Oh, as you can see, I gave it a color cyan. This button is now actually this color, but the other buttons didn't change. So it works two ways. So it's not going upside to the other button, but also not into the component. So that's really important to see. Well, but now we have our really nice counter component here. But if I click here on these buttons, it's not doing anything. So let's try to make sure that it's actually going to start doing something. Well, Mart is probably going to show later on how you make listeners using a framework, but it's also quite simple if you do it with vanilla JavaScript, because it's basically just two lines where you are going to look for the element, and on the onClick method, you're actually going to increase or decrease the. This is too big. Now you cannot read it. Better. So for this, I will also add the proper methods, which is basically just an increase method where you update the count number with a number which is one higher than before, and the same for decrease. And here it actually changes the count, which is 0 at the beginning. So now if we go back, oh, nice, it works. You can even go below 0. So this is really, really cool. The last thing that I would really like to add to this is a title, for example, because I want to have some text above it. Well, I already mentioned the slot that I have placed right here. And the slot is basically just a place where you can put in whatever you want. And in this case, it's a name slot. You can also use a slot without a name, and then it's whatever you put between the brackets of the of your custom component. It will be placed in this slot. So I have a named slot here. So in this case, I really have to mention in which slot it should actually place this. So I placed an h2 tag in this slot. And now you can see that there's actually a title above our counter using the slot. And this makes it really, really reusable because you will always have the counter, and that is not something that is going to change because it also has to work in the same way always. But I can imagine that per use case, you might want to use another title, for example, if you want to put something else in there, and then slots is a really good way to implement that. All right, so now we have our really nice working counter component, which is completely built only with HTML and JavaScript. So there's no framework involved in this case. However, what I want to show you actually is that if I have prepared, so I'm already in the React app. So if I start up the React app that I already prepared, because installing it, I didn't want to bother you with that. So this is just a basic scaffold of a React project that you get out of the box. And I'm going to show you that by adding 2 lines of code and actually copying this file here. And normally, probably in the node modules, you will have your components which you can include then from your which you can actually include from your node modules. You will use that in your application. So I'm not sure if I cannot make it bigger. So yeah, it sets components here for those who cannot read it. Right, so then I go just simply to the app.js. This I can make bigger. So this is the basic scaffold. So the only thing I need to do here is actually import from the components folder the JS file that we have just created together. And then the only thing I need to do is add my awesome router as an HTML tag. And it's going to compile. Did I make a typo? I'm going to restart the server, maybe that helps. Of course, this doesn't work if you're going to demo, so the demo gods are not really its counter. This works better, yeah. So close. All right, so as you can see, I just included it here, only added 2 lines. I added the import and I added the actual HTML element, and it works out of the box. One thing, important thing actually to mention here is, I said before that styles would not bleed in and out of a web component. There's actually an exception that I also encountered while preparing this demo. As you can see, the color and the size of this text is somehow different here than it was before. The reason for that is that if there is on a higher level is something related to fonts declared, and you don't explicitly tell the component that it should be otherwise, it will actually inherit the styles that it got from outside of the component, because that's basically just in the CSS specification, the standard setting of, for example, the font color and font size. So if you don't set it specifically, it will actually update. So that's really something to keep in mind if you are working with web components. Then after that, I also wanted to show you that in Vue it works exactly the same way. So we're going to run our Vue instance. Within the components folder again. And the reason that I need to add it here is because for sure for React, I'm not entirely sure about Vue, but they don't accept using JavaScript files which are not in the source directory, unless you explicitly tell it it's okay. But for this case, I thought it was easier to put it in the components folder, since normally you would probably use it from such a location anyway. So we have it here. So here again, the only thing you have to do is do the import of the counter component. Now I'm typing it correctly this the first time, I think. Bigger again. So import and use the HTML tag is basically all you need to do. Then we go here, and you can see again, so it takes sort of the font styles that it gets from the view scaffold, but here it also just works out of the box. So this was basically what I wanted to show to you today. Thank you for joining this first session about web components, and well, I would say let's see if there are any questions from the audience.
Right. Thank you for the presentation. It was very intriguing. I think along your talk, you said we're about to get to be experts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's at least my hope. But yeah, experts that will probably take everyone years because.
Well, I think you can call yourself quite easily an expert on a lot of things. But
I hope so.
But that said, I've checked the comments, but I haven't seen any questions. So I'll come up with a few questions. So are you ready for it?
Yeah, shoot.
So the first question, I was interested in real life examples where they use web components. Do you have a real life example that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think the amount of companies that work with web components is growing and growing. Also, a lot of our clients at Capgemini are actually working with it, and I think a really good example is, for example, ING, where they also open sourced their own component library, which is basically just a web component library. So I think that's it's really cool that they did that, and that's one of the best examples I can give about that.
So it's really open source. Everyone can access it. And
yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Another question, maybe not related to this question, but can web components easily share data between each other?
Well, I would say it's not as simple as it would be with the bigger frameworks. There's a reason that the other frameworks are bigger, because they need a lot of code to actually make these kinds of things possible. It is possible, but most of the times it will happen with event bindings. So you can use attributes to sort of give data down to a web component, because on the HTML or the custom tag that you create, you can actually give attributes, and then you will have that data available within your component. But for the upwards data communication, basically, you will probably have to use events.
Events.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, I don't have any questions, so I would like to thank you in presenting the tech talk.
You're welcome.